This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy has found the number of large U.S. companies who paid nothing in federal taxes has doubled in recent years. The companies include Amazon, Netflix, General Motors, IBM, Chevron, Eli Lilly, Delta, Occidental Petroleum, Honeywell, Prudential, Halliburton, Whirlpool, and Goodyear. Senator Elizabeth Warren recently introduced a proposal called the Real Corporate Profits Tax to force companies to pay a 7% tax on all profits over $100 million. Warren outlined the plan on MSNBC.
It's just, if you have more than $100 million in reported after-tax profits, the 100 millionth and first dollar should be taxed at 7%, and that just goes straight across the board. The simplicity of it is part of what makes it work so well and makes sure no giant corporation in this country gets away with paying zero, while small companies and families are having to pick up the ticket to run the country.
So that's presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren, and we hope she will join us on Democracy Now! We hope all those who are her friends and her close circle will hear that message, and she herself. But we are joined now by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, his latest book, People, Power, and Profits. What about this?
That's like an alternative minimum tax for corporations.
That's right. And I actually think there should be a global minimum tax, because what is going on is that they're avoiding not only taxes in the United States, but they're looking around the world for places like Panama and the tax paradises to avoid taxes. Apple was particularly, bad where they shifted all their money into Ireland from all their profits in Europe, and then did a special deal with Ireland. So they basically paid, almost no taxes, 0.02 or 0.2%. I mean, really a very low, real example of tax avoidance, almost at the level of evasion. The point I want to make, the point that Elizabeth is making, is that our big corporations are showing the same ingenuity of coming out with good products. They're showing that same ingenuity in avoiding taxes and making sure that we have laws that allow them to do that. And she's saying that's wrong. She's also emphasized that it distorts our economy. It distorts our economy in two ways. Where business gets located is distorted because you search for a tax haven, but also gives these big companies an advantage over small corporations, over individual companies. And so that's not a level playing field. The big companies expand not because they're necessarily more efficient, but because they're better at avoiding their tax obligations.
I'm wondering, Elizabeth Warren particularly has been rolling out a series now of proposals, some of them apparently very well thought out, because we have 20 Democratic candidates, but we have sort of a lack of their specifics of what they are, what they stand for. And I'm wondering what your sense...
20 tomorrow when Biden announces.
I'm wondering what you think about her student debt proposal and also her call to break up the big tech companies.
So first, let me say, you should look at these proposals in two ways. She's setting out a set of principles. We ought to have more progressive taxation and not let the corporations escape taxation. We ought to do something about the growth of monopoly power in our society. We ought to make sure that education is accessible to everybody, regardless of the income and of their parents. These are basic principles which all Americans should subscribe to. And the second thing is, here's a particular way we can implement that. And let's all be real. We all know that when we go to Congress, there'll be a lot of discussion about how to do it. And hopefully during the primaries and the election, there'll be a lot more discussion. But she's putting forward the idea that these are doable ideas. These are not pie in the sky. We can do it. We can get more progressive taxation, for instance, by a small wealth tax on those with more than $50 million. I mean, it's not going to affect even the bottom 1%. I mean, the bottom 99% are not going to be affected. We're talking about a fraction of the top 1%. So that's one example. On the
go ahead on the student loan.
On the student loan thing, we have a student debt now of $1.5 trillion. And it's so large, it's beginning to affect our macroeconomy. It's affecting individuals' lives. They can't get, buy a home, start a family because of the debt. Now,
it's a new form of indentured servitude.
It's a new form of indentured servitude. And so we have to think about in two parts. One, going forward, how do we make sure that a university education is affordable to everybody? And the second part is, what do we do with the backlog of $1.5 trillion? Now, she has a particular proposal. It's somewhat different from the one that that I've been advocating. What I think is that you should have what I call contingent repayment. If your income is below a certain level, say below $50,000, you don't pay back anything. If it's over $200,000, you might pay back 4%, and then you keep paying it back until you pay it all back. Except after 25 years, you say, "Look, you've done what you can to repay the debt, and we'll write off the rest." One way or another, we have to deal with that legacy debt problem.
Let's go to Bernie Sanders on Fox News, which was controversial in itself, but he wanted to address a Trump audience. He was speaking about democratic socialism.
Democratic socialism, to me, is creating a government and an economy and a society which works for all rather than just the top 1%. It means ending the absurd inequalities that exist today. And I want to lay this out because you're not going to hear this much on Fox, and you're not going to hear this much in the media in general. And the American people have got to conclude whether we think it is appropriate and what America is about to have 3 families owning more wealth than the bottom half of the American society, 160 million people. Whether it's appropriate for the top 1% to own more wealth than the bottom 92%. Whether it is right that 49% of all new income goes to the top 1%, when many people, Brett and Martha, who are watching this program, are working 2 or 3 jobs just to pay the bills.
So that's Bernie Sanders speaking on Fox. And again, we invite Bernie Sanders to be here on Democracy Now! At the table during this election cycle. Joe Stiglitz.
So I think he's given a good definition of what is called democratic socialism. Now, what Trump is trying to do is confuse people's minds. Traditionally, socialism, 100 years ago, was about the ownership of the basic means of production. You didn't hear a word about that from Bernie Sanders. He's not talking about that old-style socialism. He's not saying we want to bring Maduro, Venezuela to America. That's not what he's talking about. What he's really talking about is what in Europe is called social democracy, sometimes called the welfare state, sometimes. It's basically based on we need systems of social protection. We need systems to make sure that we invest in our young people, invest in our infrastructure, invest in R&D. We invest in the future, protect the climate, and protect the environment. In other words, we make our economy work for all American. And the word I use is progressive capitalism. But, is there any difference between my definition of progressive capitalism and what Bernie has called democratic socialism? No. It's all trying to get at an economy that serves our citizens. And I try to emphasize There's going to be a market part of this. And what Bernie is emphasizing, yeah, and it's also going to be a part where the government's going to have to play a role. And I emphasize both of those in my book.
Joe Stiglitz, we want to thank you for being with us. Nobel Prize-winning economist, Columbia University professor. His latest book out this week, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. That does it for our show. I'll be speaking at University of California, Berkeley at the Genetics and Plant Biology building on Saturday at 6 p.m. We'll be showing 4 days in Western Sahara, Africa's last colony, and having a discussion after. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.